What up, it's I, your proverbial boy here in Hamburg, Germany, and today I want you to imagine the following scenario. You're standing in an elevator and the doors open and into the elevator walks a person that you know could help you with your business. And if they made the right introductions, your business would totally explode and overnight basically you're extremely successful. Here's your chance and you totally blow it. Maybe you kind of stutter, you stumble over your words and you come across as just this like weirdo. Or more likely, you just overthink it and you end up saying nothing at all. They get off the elevator and you watch the opportunity walk off and it's lost forever. Now, this type of situation is where the so-called inner game comes into play. And today, we're gonna learn how to silence that inner critic and unlock your true potential. If you ever feel like your own thoughts and your own emotions are actually sabotaging your ability to connect with people, you should definitely check out the book, The Inner Game of Tennis by Timothy Galway. This will be likely one of the most important books you will ever read in your entire life because it relates to how you can get out of your head, how you can allow that sort of synergistic wisdom of the whole to take over and allow your intuition to take over and very consistently hit that so-called flow state where you just become consumed by the pure and beautiful joy of taking action. But at the same time, you also retain that competitive fire that's needed to win. Because a lot of people struggle to reconcile those two. If I'm just in this beautiful flow state, not concerned about the outcome, how do I actually win? Well, Galway talks about finding that wonderful blend of those two things in this book. Now, when I started out learning this stuff, learning how to socialize many, many years ago, basically 20 years ago now, I very distinctly remember struggling with self-doubt, struggling with overthinking in these kind of situations, in social situations in general. I remember it must have been like 2004, 2003 even. I was out with my mentor, Owen, in London, and we were at some club, and he was literally having to physically push me to introduce myself to people. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. Just the thoughts started coming in. He would literally be like goosing me in the side, like poking me in my ribs, like very violently in order to get me to go and approach. Because I just could not shut that inner voice off inside of me that was, running all of these failure scenarios through my head. And that ended up paralyzing me to the point of utter failure. Of course, ultimately I got over that. But then even when I would be able to get over that paralysis and actually go up and introduce myself to people in the actual interactions, very often in those early days, I'd be consistently trying to micromanage everything, like micromanage other people's perceptions of me. Am I looking cool? Am I saying the right thing? Et cetera, et cetera. And this typically ended up with me running out of things to say. Why? Because I couldn't come up with anything that was good enough in the moment as the conversations were unfolding dynamically. Now, on the other hand, sometimes I'd be out there and it just felt like I'd go Super Saiyan, like I turn into this absolute god of social interaction, and I'd find myself in complete flow state. Literally every word that was coming out of my mouth was absolute gold. And I used to describe that feeling, like in my journals, I'd write, I said, my eyes go bright. And I feel like I'm suddenly surrounded by this shimmering nimbus of golden, holy light. Right, that's literally I call it the nimbus. And when that happened, my limits of conversation, my limits were magically transcended. And all of a sudden I was able to perform on this objectively higher level than before. The problem was I wasn't able to replicate this on a consistent basis. It felt like my mind was a barrier between those almost magical intuitive energies and what actually ended up coming across and being perceived by other people in my speech, my body language, my entire communication. So then one day I stumbled onto Timothy Galway and this book, The Inner Game of Tennis. Now, one of the most important aspects of Galway's so-called inner game is this concept he talks about of self one and self two. Self one is the ego. It's that critical, judgmental, negative voice in our head that can be the source of a lot of social anxiety. Self two, on the other hand, is the observer, the silent, wise, and intuitive voice that can be accessed by quieting the mind down and being present to the moment. By being more aware of these two selves, we can learn to recognize when we're actually getting caught up in those negative thoughts and emotions, and we can start to take steps to correct that. So in social interactions, When you actually are able to quiet the mind down and remain in the present moment, you can access your intuition and you learn to respond to social cues that are being put out by the other person in a more natural and authentic way. And then this can help you to make deeper connections with other people and be more charismatic. Now, Galway in his book, he also emphasizes the importance of learning to let go of mistakes and learn to not dwell on them, because this can interfere with your ability to perform well in the future. In social interactions, this can translate to letting go of negative thoughts and self-doubt, which can prevent you from being fully present and opening to and connecting with other people. So for an example, I sing a lot of karaoke. And one thing that I've learned in my vocal training, if I'm on stage and I flub a note, like I kind of hit it a little flat or I kind of miss the note, very often my mind will want to process where the mistake was so it doesn't happen in the future. The problem is you're in the middle of a performance, you don't have that luxury of saying time out and analyzing that. So now I might figure out what I did wrong, but now I'm kind of on the back foot because the next notes keep coming, and now it can cause this cascading series of errors that compromises the entire performance. Additionally, this concept of relaxed concentration, it's also relevant to our social interactions. So when you learn to quiet the mind and you're more in that state of relaxed concentration, you're better able to focus on that present moment and respond to social cues that other people are giving off in a more authentic and natural way. And again, this can help you to connect with other people, as opposed to missing those social cues and having shit just blow up in your face and you're like, what happened? I don't understand. It seemed like it was going great. So I have a lot of students, and this happens pretty much every weekend on the live programs. I see the big issue is it's all about, like when they're talking to others, it's all about them, right? Their focus is entirely on what's going on in here. Do I look cool? Am I being perceived as cool? What is the story about like who I am here? And that doesn't leave any room for the other person, and as such, they're gonna miss those social cues. It's not a good experience for the other person. The other person doesn't wanna be there and they just leave. To be successful at this, yes, you have kind of have like one little eye monitoring what's going on internally, but most of your focus should be on the external. Like what's going on outside, what's going on with the other person, because again, that's going to enable you to react to those social cues very quickly so you don't get blown out. Now, all of this is very closely related to the concept of intuition, which can be thought of as a sort of form of unconscious intelligence that lets us process information and make decisions without the need to actually consciously think about it. So in social interactions, intuition, like I said a moment ago, can help us to read social cues. It can help us to respond in that more authentic and natural way. So when the mind is quiet, we're more in tune with our intuition. And you know how I said earlier that it felt a lot of times like my mind was this barrier between inner and outer. Well, when you learn to quiet the mind, it can become a bridge between inner and outer as opposed to a barrier. So those are the core concepts of Timothy Galway's Inner Game of Tennis book, but I want to add some personal insights that I had as well from the book. At the end of chapter 6, Galway describes how very often after you go on and achieve that flow state, the ego can actually sort of sneak in the back door and screw things up again. And this is something I experienced many, many times over the years. You know, after letting go and hitting that Super Saiyan, that Nimbus state, so to speak, hitting state and getting success, sometimes you'll actually kind of revert back to that trying hard as usual, and it screws things up again. And even though you know that you're performing worse, you don't go back to letting go. Now, why does that happen? Well, there's two kinds of satisfaction, okay? When you try and succeed, you try really hard and you actually get the success, you get ego satisfaction. When you trust yourself and allow it to happen, it's almost like the ego says, I didn't deserve it, right? I don't deserve the credit. I didn't do anything. And honestly, nowadays, this is how I feel most of the time when I'm socially getting success after having done this for 20 years. And this is what you should probably be aiming for as well. I sort of hear myself saying these things. It's an unconscious competence. Now, flow state, we can't describe what that is, but we can describe the characteristics that make it possible. Flow state requires the following. Number one, some sort of skill. Number two, a challenge to that skill. Number three, it requires a certain familiarity with the technique involved that you've drilled so much that it no longer requires much of the intellect's conscious attention. You can just let go and you can just allow the training to take over, right? But at that point, again, to make sure the ego doesn't sneak in the back door, you want to give self to the credit, relax, and hit the flow. Now, in chapter 7 of the book, Galway talks about how he will very often coach tennis students to simply listen to the ball. If you're playing tennis and you hit the ball properly, it makes a certain very satisfying sound. And instead of thinking, just ask your body basically to do whatever is necessary to reproduce that nice crack of the ball, right? Intuition, it holds the memory of the elements of behavior which cause that sound. Self too is not just intuition, there's also a certain aspect of kinesthetic memory involved. By the way, if you do end up reading this book, and you should, and you want to apply the lessons inside to actual social skills, simply view all of the tennis lessons through the lens of socializing. When he talks about the ball, you can think of that as the other person in the interaction. When he talks about the racket, the grip, etc., you can think of that as you and your technique. So for example, Galway says, watch the ball, but also the motion. And to translate that to social skills, it'd be like watch the person, but also watch the flow of the interaction. Right? Throughout this entire book, there's a huge emphasis on feel and awareness over thinking. And that's a key tenet of my programs that I'm reiterating constantly is awareness, awareness, awareness. It's only when you first develop awareness of what you're doing that you can start to make changes. Now, another key understanding that changed how I look at socializing was how Galway frames competition itself. Many people, in my experience, they get butthurt or even very bitter when they get rejected or when they lose in an interaction. But in Galway's eyes, it's the duty of your opponent to challenge you to rise to your greatest potential. Right? He talks about this in chapter 9. Your competitor is actually your friend. So for example, think about a surfer. If a surfer just wanted to hit the flow, he'd choose mid-sized waves to go after. But very often a surfer wants to hit the biggest waves they can because those big waves, they bring out the best in you. They challenge your courage, they challenge your skill so you can reach your true limit. Challenge and obstacles are a necessary ingredient in this process of self-discovery. So true competition is identical to cooperation. Why? Because each player is trying their best to defeat the opponent, but ultimately it isn't the other person you're defeating. It's simply a matter of overcoming the obstacles that they present to you. The other person is your friend in the interaction. The other person is your friend in the so-called competition to the extent that they do their best to make stuff hard for you. Only by competing do they cooperate in the context of the game. And this is a much, much better mentality for you to have going into socializing, okay? Rather than hoping it'll be easy and everyone's just gonna roll over and love you. It's like, fuck, I hope that they'll be skeptical when I go up to people. Why? Because it gives me a chance to shine and wow them even more. Like, holy shit, this guy's he actually stepped up. He's not like all these other idiots. Now, as I said earlier, I believe that everybody should read this book, but just to sum things up here, Galway's techniques can be applied to social situations in the following ways. Number one, cultivating awareness. This means becoming more aware of your internal dialogue, more aware of your emotional processes as you interact with people. Inhibition, control patterns that prevent you from communicating in the ways that people respond well to are very often below your threshold of awareness. You've held on to these things as being useful and necessary for your protection for so long that they're just kind of below the level of awareness. Number two, trusting your faculties, allowing that self to take over and just trusting your instincts. Thinking about that crack of the ball and just allowing yourself to replicate that. Let those impulses flow with no filter, or at least very, very little filter, right? Maybe you need some filter. But again, most people's filter is way too high, so reduce that. Number three, non-judgmental observation. Observing your thoughts, observing your emotions without judgment, just letting them pass by without holding on to them. The conversation won't stop. There's no time out for you to, again, analyze whether this is going to be useful or not, so you can't stop either. Remember, true competition is identical to cooperation. Have that view in mind when you introduce yourself to somebody and they respond skeptically. That's simply an invitation to bring your A game and wow them, which is going to make them even more impressed when you do it. As I said, this book changed my life back in the day, and if you apply these principles yourself, you're going to get similar results. And trust me, the rewards and the sense of accomplishment that you're going to feel are well worth it. Now, if you're ready to take your social skills to the next level, I'd invite you to join my 8-week Charisma Mentoring Program. This is a program that I've developed over the course of my 20 years of coaching, and I designed it to be a literal game changer. If you want to learn more about this program, you can click the link in the description below. I hope to see you inside. All right, this has been Jeffy, and I'll see you next time.
Out of all the teachers that I've seen, and this isn't bullshit, Jeff's was the only one that was actually concrete, tangible, and to the point. The others had a lot of like inner game material that was subjective and people perhaps couldn't relate to, but everyone can actually relate to the tangible points that I saw today. Even me, I could relate. So I learned something, which is very rare.